I'm going to give you a quick rundown. This is going to be the shortened version of sort of a combination of many talks I've given. In quite an unusual NSA career, I've spoken publicly more than any senior manager that's ever worked at the National Security Agency, and I'm sure my record will be intact. The number was something well over 100, probably closer to 150 public appearances in 10 years at NSA. And it's not because I am a natural extrovert or I like public speaking. It's a learned behavior. But I realized how important it was going to become to the future of the mission. So I grew up in a big government environment, right? And where the government solves the problems for you. We, the taxpayers, contribute. There's a big bag of money. The government gets to write the requirements, gets to decide who plays, who gets cleared, who is not cleared, you know, what the acceptable solution is, etc. Right? And that works in a lot of domains of our existence, right? And has historically. And that's the price we pay. That's kind of the way democracy works. It occurred to me probably 15 years ago, that's not the way this world works. Because one of the great blessings of my career is I get to see a lot of things go wrong. And I got to see them, and I'll explain it in just a minute, kind of how that goes. So the idea of understanding what is going on in this world and why can't we solve these problems that are plaguing us every day. And as Adnan said, right, these are not fundamentally different problems than we saw in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. From a technical sense, right, from a technological sense, and from an operational sense. But the problem is a lot more complicated than it ever was. So the talk is about, I offered to give a talk about the critical security controls, because it is a new thing for many of you here. But the title is a little bit different. It's, yeah, the controls I think are an important part of how we're going to have influence in the future. But the real lesson that I want you to take away, and it's the lesson that we live every day, right? That fundamentally, this is about a community approach, not a top-down government-driven approach, but a community approach to how we look at these problems and then how we're going to solve them. So that's really the focus. So always keep that in the back of your mind when you think of this. So I'm going to start off with a, for my own purpose, a slide please, Julie. So I know at the risk of, so I started an undergrad degree in mathematics. For those of you that are math phobic, and I know there's some of you out there, this is the only equation. I'm going to read it to you in plain English. I will often say, this is like a 70s guy, this is me, right? 70s guy view of the business that we're in. This is a classic risk equation. There are many variations of this out there in the literature. Go find one you like. But I'll read it in English. Risk is a function of, okay, these four variables: vulnerability, threat, consequence. And some people put countermeasures. I use controls over here. All right. So why do I put this up here? It's not because I want you to understand the math, but it's because it's for two reasons. One, it's a convenient way to talk about this problem. So vulnerability, threat, and consequence. Okay. I grew up and I live a world of vulnerability. That's the world I have studied. I've spent my entire professional life focused on that. Vulnerability is about flaws, about how things break or can be made to break. Okay. And one reason to look at this equation is to realize we actually understand, measure, and make decisions about each of these variables differently. That's been the history of the business. So vulnerability was again about flaws, 0 days, right? New attacks, weaknesses in protocols. That's what I was hired to do at the National Security Agency, you know, many years ago. That is, back in those days, we thought of security as primarily a mathematical problem. How strong is the cryptographic algorithm? How good is your randomization? How good is your key management? The notion was, if I could equate the problem of security to a hard mathematical problem, what do I get? I get centuries of analysis for free, right? If I can make it look like a hard mathematical problem, I've got some of the best brains in history who've studied that problem and can't solve it, for example. So if I can make the difficulty of breaking your algorithm equivalent to some hard problem like factoring is the general sort of history of the business, then I can make it really hard for a bad guy. That's a conceptual way to think of the problem. But vulnerability is also the variable that we understand the best, and we don't understand it perfectly, but we have the most control over it, right? If we create a piece of software, we can test it. We can give it good requirements, we can do black box testing, we can attempt to understand the vulnerability, enumerate things, decide whether it's worth fixing them or not. So that's really what I was hired to do. There's a vulnerability group at NSA that, in support of cryptographic devices, key generators, and so forth, and essentially we would call them the black hats today, right, or the red team, or that kind of thing, looking at our own stuff, preferably before the real bad guys did, and we can decide whether to fix it or not. And why did we do that? Well, go back with me to the world of the 70s and 80s, right? Just a few of you in this room are old enough to remember when conceptually This seems so quaint. We only had one enemy in this world, right? The US only had one enemy, the Soviet Union. That's the way we thought of it conceptually. We have one enemy. How much threat intelligence do we have about the one enemy? Essentially zero, right? There was no marketplace like you have today. If there was intelligence, threat intelligence to be had, you had a double top secret clearance in the US government. And the classic trap, you get to know this, but you can't tell anybody else, and you can't do anything about it. Well, what good is it knowing about it then, right? But that's the way the business kind of worked. So we didn't really know much about threat. So how did we understand this problem of risk? Well, we hired a bunch of geeky guys like me to go in the back room and pretend to be the threat, right? We would be given access to certain information, and we would pretend to be, how good are you? Can you act like the Soviets, for example? And given the strength of their mathematics, and their mathematics are very, very good, and their compute power, and at that time it was pretty good. And the idea was, can we pretend to be the threat so that we can identify vulnerabilities and then make decisions about what we're going to fix, right? And especially, I worked a lot in the software of nuclear weapons. Sometimes this variable dominates the conversation. So nuclear weapons, you know, the consequence of failure is unthinkable, right? It's off the charts. So you're willing to say, given the consequence, I'm willing to spend a ton to fix vulnerability, right? But again, think of the world of the 70s. The government really controlled this problem. It was a monopoly issue. One of my talks is I'm a reformed monopolist. Okay? And what I mean by that is I grew up in a world where the government controlled the problem. We decided who got to play, right? We decided who the acceptable vendors are. We decided if you got a clearance or not. We decided if that software was acceptable or not. And we could do that. You can do that. You'd love to do that, right? But you can only pull that trick off if you have tons of money, lots of time, and you have control of the environment. How much of that do we have today? Zip, right? We don't have all the money we wish we had. We don't have all the time because the market's moving too quickly. And we certainly don't have control of the environment, right? Even the most sensitive applications of the US government have to work with stuff that's off the shelf, have to deal with lots of partners that they don't actually trust, right? These are very complex times. So when you think about risk, then it's all about how do I factor all these or integrate these variables together? And this is what we do every day, even whether we realize it or not. We do it at a technical level. And what's happening now, and it's actually the right thing, our business is shifting from a technology focus, right, which is where vulnerability is. When you start to bring in threat, what do you care about there? It's less technology. You care more about what we call in the business actors, right? Adversaries. What is their intent? What is their capability? What are they going to try to do to us? Okay, and so we put out sensors. We buy threat feeds, we hire people, and we try to understand that part of the business now. So it's that we actually have a rich variety of information, right? This overwhelming variety of information to help us understand that. We had none of that when I grew up in this. And again, we still have this issues of consequences. This is becoming a business issue, an economic issue, right? This issue of risk is no longer the domain of geeky people. I'll just point to me, not to you. It's really about business decision making, right? And we're all affected. Jane talked about the connectivity that binds us. What that does is it drives this consequence. It makes it impossible to separate yourself from the environment and partition yourself from everybody else. So you have to care about the security of everybody else because tomorrow they might be your partner. And the old federal model of it, and we'll just identify only the critical data, and we'll only protect the critical data, and we'll only allow the cleared people to touch it. You can't pull that off very often anymore, right? You know, and things like the Home Depot, Sony, you know, Target, all these things remind us stuff we would never have considered critical in the past is critical. Who would have thought business gossip in a movie production company would become critical to the future prospects of that business, right? The sniping and, you know, backroom gossip of who's hard to get along with in the business, that kind of stuff has become important business information. No one would have predicted that, or no one did that I'm aware of. So this is my life. Controls then are a way that we manage or integrate across these, right? I can put in place controls to minimize my vulnerability. Sometimes you'll hear people say, minimize my attack surface is a typical way. I can put in controls to, when I learn about threat, now I can respond to it by blocking a port, deleting a file, etc., and that kind of stuff. I can do architectural things to minimize the consequences. That is, I can partition off, I can DMZ certain functions so that people who need external access can do that, but cannot get to our intranet, right? So we have to have ways to manage all these things. So this is important because it helps you understand the context of why we're doing things, but it also is important to understand because this is my whole career, right? I've lived this. from vulnerability into threat into controls, and consequences of control. So this is kind of the life that I have. Next slide. Here's some unfortunate facts. These were true in the 70s. These were true in the 80s and 90s. And this is the vast majority of problems that we see in the environment that are plaguing us today, cost us time, money, etc. This is not a surprise because you guys watch it every day, right? This folks over here are actually known problems, known solutions, basic housekeeping, hygiene kind of stuff. That's pretty sad. The second one is even sadder. This is the U.S. CERT's official number. 85% of the incidents tracked by the U.S. CERT are based upon the presence or absence of basically the same 5 basic defenses, right? Controls. They use a little bit different terminology for there. This is actually doesn't, those of us that claim to be information security professionals, this doesn't speak very well to our professionalism, does it, right? The vast majority of things that plague us today are known problems, have been known for a long time. So what does that tell you? Does that tell you frontline defenders are sloppy, don't care, right, or incompetent? Actually, no. What it tells us, we as a society, as a community, have gone about this wrong, right? This is really a very unfortunate fact, but it's again, as true today as it was. What it tells us is we have sort of a basic behavior management, incentives and so forth problem. We know the technical issues. We know how to solve them. The solutions are in the marketplace. But we're not able to put them in place. People don't understand. It's too complicated. So here's what's really happened. And these are from a SAN survey here, right? Most of these things should be blocked. Here's what's really going on here, I think, at a sort of conceptual level. So remember the world I grew up in, right? Sort of one monopoly service provider, one enemy, one very little information about what to do about it. We are now in an entirely different situation a few years later. We are drowning in stuff, right? We have too many choices to make. It's confusing to people. They can't decide who to trust. They can't decide what to do first. They are overwhelmed. Every auditor tells them something different. The insurance companies are telling something different. The government, you want 10 opinions, hire 5 consultants. The marketplace is flooding you with magic beans and super solutions to everything. People don't know what to do. So this phenomenon, Julie, if you give me a slide here. So I coined this phenomenon about a year and a half ago, the fog of war. Anyone who has a DoD background might smile. Thank you, Steve. There was a famous book, right, whatever it was, The Fog of War. I don't know if you remember when that book came out, but a lot of discussion. As warfare became more complex and became information-driven, this fog of war was the term that was phrased in a famous book about the complexity of really, really high-risk decision-making in very complex information environment, where you're flooded with information and you aren't sure, right, of the quality of that information many times. And so it's a very complex problem. People's lives are at stake, national interests are at stake, and how do you understand this problem? Well, in our business, it's this stuff, right? All these things that people have to deal with. Security catalogs and frameworks and regulatory things and technical things and, exciting new technologies. So the market is a very noisy place. People can't sort it out, and they don't know what the next thing they ought to do is. So that was my observation starting maybe 15 years ago. We're headed for a really difficult period here, and how are we going to help people make sense of this? So I started a campaign, I mentioned some of these things yesterday, about releasing the stuff that NSA was doing to the public. We were producing security guides for the DoD, the intelligence community, and so forth, right about the time CIS started, right? So it was great. I had a private sector, parallel, nonprofit partner doing very similar work around benchmarks. And to me, that was a powerful idea. Government trying to get its act together, heaven help us, working with the private sector to align our interests. And so that became the real start of the campaign to help us get us down this road. So at some point, though, I became aware that, frankly, me at NSA, I was a contributor to the fog. Right? Releasing all this stuff is great, but hey, it's competing for attention with CIS benchmarks and NIST checklists and all these other things. And I had great customers to work with, folks like I mentioned John Gilligan, right, the chairman of our board, CIO of the Air Force, and he kept hitting me with this, what do I do next? Your red teams are kicking the teeth out of my folks every year. What do I do? And I would tell him all these grand things. He'd go, yeah, but what do I do next? What are the first things that we ought to do? So I gathered a group of folks. There was a kind of an afternoon conversation around a table no bigger than this, and a few others that were brought in. And the challenge I gave our team was, what do you think all our best friends should do first? What should people do first? Not to solve world hunger. One of the problems in this business, if you're going to do 100 things, and then a consultant will tell you, yeah, but you're going to do 10 more. Well, how much money should I spend? Well, how much did you spend? Spend more. It's a never-ending problem. And when you have that, it's part of the fog. You don't know what to do first. I said, don't try to solve world hunger here. What 5 to 7 things should everybody do? And of course, people being what they were, I couldn't get them to agree to 5 to 7. So we came up with a list of 10, 2-page letter, I don't dream this big. It went down to the Pentagon, the Joint Staff, Gilligan, and folks like that, right? The SANS Institute gets a hold of it. SANS does nothing in small style. If you've ever seen this poster, SANS turns it into a worldwide movement. You know, I'm still in the government, and this is the official SANS poster on the critical security controls. They produced something called the Consensus Audit Guidelines, which was the first generation of this, chaired by John Gilligan himself after he left the Air Force. And I have a few of these, and we'll leave them here. But it sort of took on a life of its own. And the notion was about practice, right? That if we change the way people do things and help them focus on a small number, we can make much more progress. So one more slide, Julie. So this was the kind of official picture of the controls. You can't read them from back there, but any experienced person in this business, you'll look at this list and go, yeah, okay, yeah, you know. There's no rocket science in this, right? These are basic practices backed up by the opinion of a number of people. That original number of people was 5, you know, and then 10, and then SANS turns it into thousands and thousands of people offer an opinion. So fast forward, you know, I leave the government, I go to SANS to run some special projects because it would fit the lifestyle that I was prepared to lead after my first act in professionalism. And I wind up taking this over again and got permission from SANS to spin it out to a nonprofit company, which led us to the Center for Internet Security. So I'm the keeper of this kind of basic idea, the concept, the cat herding and so forth. Catherine Burns is the program director who's bringing, you know, real management to this and a schedule and looking at all the alignment issues that go with it. So for those who are interested in this and live this kind of stuff, there's plenty of materials on our website and we can talk about later, and I won't go through these in detail, but it's really an idea around community building, right? Getting smart people to agree. And there's nothing harder in this business than getting people to agree, right? I mentioned yesterday, right, you know, it's a business full of incredibly bright people who are incredibly opinionated. You ever hear a quote so good you wish you had said it first? Okay, the one that's for me is, shoot, I can't remember the guy's name, a SANS instructor, Hal Pomerantz. Okay, he once said, and I got his permission to use the quote, "The problem with the information security business is that the experts agree on 90% of what needs to get done, you know, in toto. They agree 90% of the time. The problem with the InfoSec business is that they spend 90% of their time arguing to the death about the last 10%, right? You've been in those meetings, right? That's the problem with this business. That's another fog issue. Because all these bright, opinionated people, there's a little bit of showboating going on here, right? There's a little bit, I know more than you. And so the real challenge for me in cat herding is getting people over that and recognizing that the greater good is served by agreement. My gosh, in any part of our lives, if you can get 90% agreement among experts, you ought to go with it, right? You got to do something about that. That's important. And why focus on that last 10%, right? There are other ways to manage the 10%. So my guidance to my team was always this: focus on agreement, manage your differences separately. And there's many examples of how we did that at NSA. Focus on agreement, manage your differences separately. That is no different in philosophy, basically, than the checklist friends back here. I'm sorry, benchmark friends back here, right? Because that's how you do these things. And the challenge is reminding people the greater good is served by agreement, not by showboating that I'm a little smarter than you. And that's the problem that you have to overcome. And the good news is, if you have enough people of goodwill, there's tremendous amounts of goodwill in this business that will let you get to that point. Well, one more slide, please. So there's a couple things. Again, my strategy is peaceful coexistence. Remember that fog-clad thing there, right? You know, there's a gazillion, every enterprise on Earth is regulated or watched over or has to report to one or more, in fact, many more regulatory compliance, et cetera, things. We don't want to create yet another one, okay? And by the way, what we do, no one has to pay attention to, right? This is all voluntary. We're not trying to be the official anything. If someone wants to adopt us as official, that's great, we will help them, but we could care less, frankly, conceptually. Maybe Jane cares, but I don't. But the idea is, if you look at this poster here, really the highlight of the last, this is 1 year old now, this gigantic chart in the middle, which you cannot quite read, is the mapping from the critical controls to basically maybe another dozen or so formal frameworks, from ISO and COBIT and the DHS CDM program, the Australian Top 35, PCI, the NIST cybersecurity framework, et cetera. We're not trying to compete with any of those. We're not aiming for the total completeness that any of them are. What we're really trying to do is focus people on a relatively small number of things that we think are driven by real knowledge of what's happening out there, by real knowledge of bad guys. Not these infinite lists of everything you could possibly do because it's a good thing to do, right? That's not our place. Other folks do that better than we could ever do, like the NIST folks. They're really good at the 800-53 catalog, if that means anything to you. We don't need to recreate that. They're not very good at prioritizing. They're not very good at helping you understand what you ought to do. That's not their mission. They're not funded to do that, and frankly, they're just not interested in that problem. So it's left to folks like us to figure that out. So in a lot of ways, we're a common core that allows us to operate kind of as a center of lots of other things. Oh, I want my $1.50 from Rick Camo for opening up this thing again. As mentioned, this is the a little bit older now, but it's the mapping from the critical controls into CIS benchmarks. And it's incredibly detailed, right? There's some really great analysis here. And what it tells you, that benchmarks sort of fit everywhere, right? Benchmarks are the way we sort of turn the knobs and throw the switches and do configurations of individual pieces of IT. So that's the very detailed, specific, you need to do this, do that, don't do that kind of stuff. The controls are at this slightly more abstract level, right? What we say in the controls is you need to do something like the benchmarks. You need to have, don't do this yourself, you need an open, vetted, supported, good configuration practice that you implement, that you manage to, that you report on. And if you do that, tons of your security problems are very, very well managed, right? So that's the level that the controls work at. And we point specifically to CIS benchmarks. We also point to the NIST checklist program, right, for government agencies who have to deal with that officially. So that's kind of where we fit. One more slide, please, Julie. And I'm conscious of our time here. So supporting this, remember the original model, right? I'm making a claim that you should listen to the controls because it's driven by knowledge of threat. Well, where does that come from? Well, it originally came from the way we always do things in this business. Let me go grab some smart friends, okay? Put their heads together and make them agree. Okay, well that's nice, and that works, right? If you can get in a big enough group of friends, like a SANS can do, right? Like the CIS can do with benchmarks, a lot of folks will go with that. They'll look at the people involved and they'll go, I couldn't hire those people. They're really smart. So if they say something, maybe I should pay attention to it and try to do something with it, right? That's been the original model of this. I'm going to give you just a brief hint of where we're going now. So we did this with the controls, right? 5 friends, thousands of people on the mailing list. Here's the next step. Anyone in this business in the room familiar with the Verizon data breach report? If you're in this business and you do not glance at this every year, shame on you. Okay, you should be familiar with this. It's the sort of glossiest, nicest, most authoritative summary of what's going wrong out there, as collected by the Verizon business model with a bunch of their partners, right? So it's worth a read. It's very easy reading, good analysis, good team that works on this. They got a bunch of data scientists and smart folks. If you look in the back, though, anyone else notice this? In the recommendation section, right? What they do is they summarize from their data, right? Not making this up. From their data, they summarize the most important problems by different ways to slice them, different classes of problems. And then, before they go to publication, they call me. And they say, we're ready. Here's our preprint version. And we swap spreadsheets back and forth to map from the summary of the problems that they see into the critical controls. And you can find the chart in the back here. Okay? So, and then it goes to publication. Right? This is the 3rd year in a row we've done this. So what are you getting here? Look at the workflow, or the data flow here. From real data, right, really analyzed, charted, summarized, trended, put into a form that's very digestible for average humans. You create a summary of the problem as these folks see it in their data, one data set, or one large data set, and you map it into potential solutions by category. That's what the controls are. And then the marketplace has responded very favorably over the last few years, right? Frank probably knows better than I do, but most now of the traditional security tool vendors, right, the Qualys, Tenable, Symantec, McAfee, those kind of guys, they on their own put out a white paper or PowerPoint that says, dear potential customer, we help you implement critical control 1 through 4 and 7. We help you implement 19 and 20. So they make a claim. So from data, summary of problem, categories of potential solutions, specific choices in the marketplace, right? That's the way to view that. That is a better workflow than we've ever had in the history of this business, right? So if we can pull this off, we have done something different. We've tried to match what you ought to do with your options to do it against the problems as exemplified by data. I guarantee you no one's doing any better than that. And I'm not saying that with any ego here. That's just the fact of this business, right? We're running it on folklore and fog right now. We need more discipline to this. Well, we just finished the same exercise that we did with Verizon with Symantec. If you look at the Symantec ISTR, Internet Summary Threat Report or something, same deal, right? Volunteers mapping from there. Hewlett-Packard, done the same. We have promises from folks like, oh, thank you. These other folks have all agreed, and lots of others have already agreed. The only question is getting to them, to start mapping from these data-derived summaries into the controls. And then what we're doing next, I'm working with the US CERT, I have sort of a start with the FCC, and my dear friends here at the MSISAC, right? What we need to start doing is not just sort of this manual mapping from threat reports into the controls, but creating an open, I think, what is, Adnan calls them buckets, I think, or something, bins, buckets, an open categorization of these problems into which all these threat folks map what they're seeing, right? And this is not rocket science. There are plenty of candidates of this kind of stuff already floating around in the marketplace, just people haven't agreed on one. So that's all I'm trying to do is get people to agree on one. So we map from all these different sources into these categorizations, then we map to the controls. Oh, and by the way, you can map to any control framework you want. Because here's the problem that I think we need to solve. It's not the absence of threat data that's paralyzing us, right? There's a gazillion threat feeds you can go out and buy today. It's not the absence of reporting. How many hundreds of thousands of indicators did someone mention that we're sending out all the time, right? We got lots of information to work from. That's good. But too much information, too much data is fog, is noise. And the real trick, why does anyone want to subscribe to these? Why do people want them? Do they want to become threat experts? No. They actually just want to know what to do about it, right? It's the translation into action. Action being what practices, what system things can I do based upon this. They don't actually want to read millions of data points out there. What they want to know is what steps can I take? Better practice, running of my network, configuring of my systems, so that I don't have to worry about 90% of it. So that most of it is just managed in a way that's inherent in the operation of the systems, right? When you wash your hands, this is Jane's favorite example, when you wash your hands in the morning, you're not thinking of the list of bacteria and viruses that you're removing, right? You know that there are scientists thinking about it, that there's data. You know that through hand contact is a transmission of disease, and you take simple practices that allow you to interrupt that cycle, right? To break that cycle of transmission. But you don't think about it. It's so inherent in the way that we just act as a society, right? And some people are required to do it, right? Doctors, nurses in hospital settings. Some of us do it. And we enforce it through a mix of like required if you're a doctor. But we enforce it mostly through societal means, right? People will look at you funny, frankly, if you don't wash your hands after certain moments in our day, right? They will shun you. And if you cough on people, they won't want to sit with you anymore. We would force things through a mix of requirement, marketplace, like discounts on insurance, and through societal pressure, right? That's just inherent in the way we operate as citizens. So we have to learn to think of how do we do this kind of stuff in this business also. So this is kind of the picture of it. I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit over, but one more, and then I'll cede my time. One more slide, please, Jim. Okay, this is a good finish here. So a couple of things I want to close with you here. So it's the controls are not magic, right? What's really important is sort of all the things that go with it. This community building. This is a little hard to read. This is actually my working notes, but what's really going to happen is the creation of an ecosystem of activity around the controls. If you want a great list of things to do, go look up the NIST stuff, go look up ISO. They're all good lists, right? That's not the problem from my perspective. It's how do we decide what's important, right? Prioritize. How do we solve problems that no one enterprise should solve by themselves? Do we really think every enterprise on earth ought to read every one of these amazing threat reports? I always ask this when I'm talking to industry folks. How many of you enterprise owners have like a room full of people who have enough time to read all these things during the year, right? They're all great. Make sense of it, translate it in action, so forth. Never a hand goes up unless you're a big financial company or you're a government agency, frankly. And there's only a few government agencies that have that kind of horsepower to do that. That's a problem that no one of us should solve by ourselves, right? These are great reading, but it doesn't make sense to have everybody trying to solve that basic hygiene problem. What should I do? What's the basic problem? So the idea is there's the controls, there's the threat model I talked about, there's lots of players in that. We mentioned yesterday the need to build kind of a tracking of users, adopters, and working aids and support for people and mappings to things like the benchmarks and the, formal frameworks, all that stuff. we're building up the sort of map of those things that need to be created. We have amazing volunteers working on this, people that we could not afford to hire, cheerfully put their time into this. We talked about the auditor certification, hygiene campaign, where we're working out kind of the messaging that allows us to align the campaign with controls, with benchmarks. So there's a lot to be done here that's very exciting from our perspective. How can we build kind of this sort of set of complementary activities? How do we enlist the great talent that we have in this room to both manage, support, do outreach, help answer the questions, market, pull all the total picture together. So this is the story. I'll tell you about the controls. As I mentioned, think of this as really about an exercise in community building, right? That is inherent in the model that we have here at CIS. So this is what I've decided to spend my second act on. I thank all of you in the room and the company in general for giving us the opportunity and the platform to do this. And the alignment with the things, the culture, the mission of CIS is so good that we couldn't have dreamed it up any better. So thanks for the opportunity. I'm family now, so I really hope that you get a chance to understand more about this. This won't be the only occasion I'm up here, so if you're interested in this sort of stuff, obviously I could talk your ear off for hours on it, but I won't today. So with that, thank you all very much for the time.